Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marie, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's webinar. A heartfelt welcome to each of you for joining us. We'll delve into the topic, modeling the revenue and operation of batteries in the national electricity market over decades. So we are absolutely delighted to have such an incredible audience with us today, and we deeply appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedule to participate. So this session is designed to provide valuable insights and practical takeaways, and we aim to make it not only informative, but also interactive and enjoyable. But before we begin, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules. So all participants will be muted and your cameras are all turned off throughout the webinar to enable our speaker to present without interruption and of course for your privacy. And if your connection stops, just log off and log back in, and you'll be in the webinar room once again. Feel free to submit any question during the presentation using our Q&A panel. And please be informed that this session is being recorded and will be shared to the registered attendees after the event. So thank you for your cooperation, and let's make this webinar a smooth and enriching experience for everyone. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. So joining us today, we have Oliver Nunn, Director of Endgame Analytics. So without much further delay, I'll pass the virtual floor to Oliver. Oliver, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Marie. So look, first of all, great to see we've got such a great turnout in terms of attendees. I can see that there are 62 people. So my name's Oliver Nunn. I'm the Managing Director of Endgame Analytics. You might have known us previously as Endgame Economics, but we decided very recently, in fact yesterday, that we were more a firm of mathematicians than we are economists. So we've rebranded accordingly. So if those of you who know us are a bit surprised to see that, that's the explanation. And what I think is really interesting is that this is the work that we've been doing and thinking around the issue of the operation of batteries in the national electricity market. People come to us all of the time for questions around batteries, and I can see from the list of attendees that many of you are people who are in the industry. Some of you are people I haven't seen before. So maybe you're just interested in understanding the operation of batteries and what it means for the future of our power system. My major takeaway that I think you guys need to take away from the presentation today is that optimization is a very powerful tool for us to look at the operation of batteries. And in particular, using tools like Gurobi is incredibly useful and gives us a whole lot of insights into how these devices operate, the benefits that they can provide, and how the broader power system can evolve with them. So a little bit about us. We're a firm which is 4 years old, and we're focused on providing mathematical modeling and economic advice in the energy sector. We do work in other sectors, but energy is really where we do most of our work. And we've advised on a range of different topics. You know, from the closure of Eraring Power Station, where we advised the New South Wales government, to major projects in areas like gas and transmission as well. So you'll have probably seen our work come up throughout your day-to-day work yourselves. And I think that sort of signals the fact that we consult across the whole supply chain. And one of the things about batteries is that batteries are changing the way that not just the generation operates, but also the way that transmission and distribution and even final consumption at the home operates. Batteries are a game changer for the electricity sector, and they're no longer a sort of a theoretical concept that might one day be important. They are now literally the thing that we are consulting on most on our day-to-day work. So before we start, this is a presentation about modeling. And what I like to tell people before we start is how we think about the role of modeling. And I think that this is really important, is that sometimes people come to us and they say, how accurate are your predictions about the future? And I have to tell them, I'm really sorry, but I didn't forecast that there was going to be a war in the Ukraine. I also didn't forecast that on the 27th of November 2024, that it was going to be a really hot day and that we were going to see really high prices. And they seem a little bit disappointed when I tell them that I can't predict the future. But what I try and tell them is that the whole purpose of modeling is that in a very, very uncertain world where many things can happen, modeling can help us make informed decisions through understanding how variations of possible future worlds change the outcomes for different participants and for consumers. And so when we're thinking about the role of modeling, what we're trying to get is insights, and those insights can help us make better decisions. So the first thing I want to talk about today is why are we even talking about modeling batteries? And the major point here is that despite the fact that we've got lots of different views around about how batteries will play a role and what their role might be, it is unequivocally the case that they're going to play a significant role in the energy transition. But, you know, investing in these assets is not without risk or uncertainty. There is a great deal of risk and uncertainty around what a battery is going to do. And a lot of the time we're getting people approaching us and saying, look, we want to put money into batteries, or we want to sign a contract with a battery, but we don't really know how beneficial that's going to be. And I think the things to think about that are really complicated for working out the uncertainty associated with batteries are, first of all, how's the whole grid going to evolve into the future? What's the landscape going to look like in which batteries operate? What are the prices going to be in the market? We see lots of different forecasts of prices. And I know that, for example, we have a very different view of what market prices are to some of our competitors in the market who provide different forecasts. The other thing is as well is that a lot of the questions we get are around how should batteries be designed before they get put in. Not all batteries are equal. Some batteries are longer storage. Some have different technologies that mean they have different cycle rates and degradation. And so those are really important decisions that can make a big difference to the role of batteries. And the final one is, how are these batteries going to operate? We actually provide advice to people about how to bid batteries into the market, and we give them tools that help them do those sorts of things. And interestingly enough, the way that a battery operates, whether it engages in some markets and not others, can drastically alter its profile of operation and its payoffs. So when we say the electricity sector is evolving, what do we really mean? Well, I think it's so important to understand that the level of uncertainty that we're talking about here is just absolutely massive. Um, we've got things that we reckon we sort of understand, like what the future level of residential and industrial demand might be. But then we've got some things which we're not sure about, like how many electric vehicles are going to come into the system, how much rooftop PV will there be, um, what is the amount of batteries that are going to come in at a small scale, and then we've got other technologies which are just big game changers, like VPPs, virtual power plants, and vehicle to grid capabilities. Electric vehicles and whether those electric vehicles are charging one way or another. And as well, even though we're not big fans of the technology, hydrogen is also something that governments are very keen on. And they can drastically change the load profile of a system just by putting in a relatively small hydrogen plant is actually relatively large in terms of load. And then we get questions as well about really complicated topics like data centers. Um, and what we see is that if there's lots of data centers in the system, we may have a completely different load profile to what we've thought we would have in the past. So there's a lot of risk in how the system is evolving, and people want better answers about the future, and in particular, how their battery is going to operate. I think the big thing to say here at the outset is that the grid is going to change massively over the next 20 years. This is just one of the forecasts that we use of the future grid. And what you can see is we're moving from the left-hand side where we've got small amounts of wind and solar to the right-hand side where we have huge amounts of wind, solar storage, and where we're relying on gas as our firming technology, the technology that can shore up the supply of renewables when required. This is an enormous change, an absolutely enormous change. And it's a once in a generation, if not once in a century change in a major part of our society. And so the idea that we can just come into this and use historic prices or market outcomes as the basis of how things are going to change into the future is just completely wrong. We need a bottom-up approach that captures these sorts of factors. So one of the other points to make is as well is that it's not even clear what that future pathway for the transition is going to be. We've just got here a few of our house scenarios that we model. And what you can see is that we've got the orderly transition, which is where everything goes according to the government's plans. We largely tell people that's not going to happen. And other scenarios where things happen more slowly, but then ramp up in the future. And you can see that there are lots of different pathways for the transition. Some of them have more solar, some of them have more storage, but all of them are enormous changes to the system that we currently have. So one of the points here is that really the times when prices occur is critical to when modeling storage. This is just a chart of the average profile that we see in a lot of our different scenarios. And you can see that we're talking about a profile that sees very low prices in the middle of the day when solar is generating, and much higher prices in the evening and overnight. So, oh, that's okay. I'll answer the questions at the end. So we'll go to questions at the end, by the way. So those of you who have questions, we'll go to those questions at the end. But really one of the questions is here is this is the average price. What is the actual, hour to hour price look like? It's much more volatile. And so the times when prices occur and the prices um, that occur at different times of the day are really critical when modeling storage. And you can already see here the basic business case for storage: charge in the middle of the day, discharge in the early in the early evening and early morning. But it's more complicated than that because the prices can be much more volatile. So one of the things that we've come to now is the question of optimization. Why are we talking about optimization? Optimization is the way that we capture all of this information into a single decision. And optimization yields literally millions of output variables as we look over the course of the next 20 to 25 years. So if we're trying to work out how these things are going to operate, we can't just take a single day or a single year and then project it forward. We actually have to look at how the system is evolving into the future. And if you want to understand how something as complicated as a battery will operate, you really need the data. And one of the things that I find so powerful about optimization as a technology is that it gives you as much data as you need. There's literally every single output can be provided from one of these models. And that includes things like dual variables, which tell us the economic value of different constraints in the system. It tells us what the value of how much energy there is in the battery at a given point in time. It tells us how much discharge there is at a point in time. It's a way of bringing together so much complexity into a really, really um, uh, unified model of thinking. And I think that the biggest thing as well is that it answers the question of how will that battery operate ideally before we even build it. You know, if you have to go out and look at batteries that have been operating in the market and say how much have those batteries been operating in the past, and that's your only reference point for the future, that is a very hard way to make a decision about something in a system that is changing as much as it is. And so using Gurobi, we're able to actually model 20 years of battery operation in less than 5 minutes. And so we can look at 50 different configurations of batteries in a matter of days. We can look at all sorts of different worlds. And the power of that is that we can bring into it all sorts of decision making. We can factor in not just the power of, not just the role of a battery in providing energy, but also of providing other services to the market. So how does it actually work? What's the mechanics behind this? Well, the first thing is that we learned long ago that even though we weren't as worried about these other markets, a lot of our clients were. And the markets that are out there, there are actually 11 markets, but we show here 9 of them, mainly because of the fact that these are the 9 ones that are the ones that have been around for the longest. There are now 2 additional services for very fast raise and very fast lower, which can easily be incorporated into all of this analysis. But we'll just show these ones for the purposes of this presentation. And what we see is that there are these different markets. You've got energy arbitrage, which is the biggest market, right? That is a very deep market, which is for moving energy around from one point of time to the next over the course of a day. But then there are actually these raise regulation and lower regulation services, which are about the batteries providing the balancing service to the market to keep our frequency within certain control bands, the frequency of the market, which is the heartbeat of the market. And the reason we say that's so important is because these services have historically been provided not by batteries, but by existing thermal power stations. And now they're being provided by batteries at much lower cost. So they're very interesting from the perspective of batteries for the whole system. And then the final one is these contingency markets, markets where batteries provide the power to inject power into the system very quickly when required, so that if there are big changes like a unit drops off or a unit falls off, we can actually push that energy into the system really quickly. So how do we actually formulate these models? Well, we've just got a basic chart here. We won't go details into the formulation, but we have to capture things like losses, the losses for a battery, the round trip efficiency, the throughput, how much you're actually pushing through the system, in terms of how much is going into the battery and out of the battery, of course, which is a major variable. What are the storage limits? How much can you actually put in a battery before you reach its limit? And then you've got things like reserves. How much capacity is left in reserve to push more energy or pull more energy from the system as required? The other one is cycling limits. So a lot of the time, a lot of our results are drastically altered by thinking about different levels of cycling. So whether you can actually run the battery once a day or twice a day or 10 times a day makes a big difference to the outcomes. And the other one as well is the derating that occurs over time as the battery degrades. So those are the parameters that we're changing. But the real challenge around the battery modeling workflow is, what are we putting into this thing in terms of the assumptions before we even start the modeling? And I think one of the things is that we often have to look at different scenarios and tell people, well, in these scenarios, the batteries make a lot of money, and in these scenarios, the batteries don't. And that changes over time as we look into the future. The other thing is, as well, is what's the design of the battery? There is a big difference in how a 1 hour battery operates to how an 8 hour battery operates. And the actual design of the battery is one of the first things that people ask us to test. I just got a request for proposal from a client who wanted us to test 4 different battery designs. And they wanted to work out which is the best battery design for them and for their for the future. The other thing is, as well, is what markets are you even going to assume the battery participates in into the future? Sometimes people are not interested in participating in smaller markets or have different views on the outlook for those markets. And so they don't want to rely on the revenue from those markets. That's the point at which we solve the model. So once we've got all that information, we solve the model. And actually the solving of the model, because of things like Gurobi, is actually really straightforward once you've formulated the problem. It's just a matter of plugging in the inputs and having the right formulation. And then at that point, you can pump through as many different models as you want. And then the great thing is that we can then look at all the outputs and we can understand better how these things are operating. We can gain insights into how a battery will operate 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if the market evolves in the way that we want, we think it's going to. And also what the risks are if the market evolves in a completely different way. And we can do this all from our desktop. We don't have to go out and build billion-dollar batteries in order to work out how much money we're going to make, right? We can actually do these assessments from a desktop. And obviously there's uncertainty about what the future is going to look like. But if you consider the difference in cost between using some clock cycles and getting some insights and having to wait for the future to occur before we get any insights into it, it's a simple decision. I think the other thing is, as well, is that batteries operate in very different ways. We can see here from our chart that we've got a couple of different batteries. We've got a 4-hour duration battery and an 8-hour duration battery. And in this instance, we can just see some of the complexity of the different ways that this is captured. But one of the things that we've noticed with our work is that sometimes when you change the duration or the size of a battery, you can really get different operational profiles. And so it's worthwhile doing these sorts of studies to understand better what the design decisions are. So, what's an example of this being applied? Well, let's look at the value that we would have captured historically for some of these assets. What happens when we take a 1 megawatt battery, we make some assumptions about degradation, and we look at 1, 2, and 4-hour duration options. So 3 different configurations, all with a daily cycle limit of 1. And what we can see is that the outcomes historically have been very different, but depending on what region of the country you're in. In New South Wales, there have been more muted prices. In Queensland, we've seen a lot of volatility in 2022 during the energy crisis. And in South Australia, where there are many more renewables, we see more volatility and therefore more benefit in terms of how much the cycles actually earn per spread, for the spread that's earned per cycle. But even this is a relatively straightforward exercise to engage in. We can go through and ask the question of how that battery would have operated optimally versus how it did in reality, and we can get a completely different outcome to if we use a different battery configuration. So one of the things that I love about this is that it gives us a benchmark that we can then say, look, your battery's not going to earn any more than this number. This is the absolute best that you could have done in that market. And I think that that's really powerful because it takes away a lot of the mystique from the whole exercise, which is maybe the battery could earn all of this money if all of these things happened in the future. We can actually say, well, at the very best, your battery can only earn this amount of money. So where does this tie in with solvers? And where does this tie in with optimization? Well, I think the big thing to point out is that we've tried to do this sort of exercise with open source tools. And open source tools are just not capable of solving in the time required to actually give you the sort of solutions that are helpful for the future. I mean, you can use open source tools if you want to save some money, but realistically, if you want to do these things in a reasonable amount of time, you have to look to tools like Gurobi. And in our experience, Gurobi is the best among them. One of the things that we found really powerful as well was that Gurobi works really well with Python libraries. And so the actual platform that we're already using to do all our data wrangling for data inputs and data outputs is also the same one that we use to talk to Gurobi. I think another thing to talk about here is how important those solver settings are. And so if you're doing some work in these areas and you're finding that your solve times aren't as good as you would have liked, get in touch with some of the people at Gurobi and they can really help you understand how to better make use of the solver settings. We've seen changes which have resulted in increases of an order of magnitude in the speed of the solve. Now it's already very fast, but it's great to get results even faster. I think the other thing is as well is that there are also market aggregations. We've developed a formulation that benefits from knowledge of how similar markets function. And so when we look at other markets across the world, we can get very, very good results using the exact same formulation or one that's very similar. And so you can just take this formulation and put it into another market. And I think that's really important too, is that this isn't just limited to Australia. The fact that we're using these tools tells us that in Australia tells us that they work in the NEM, the National Electricity Market, but we've already been approached to do similar things in other markets where we're trying to get batteries to answer different questions. And so one of the great things about this is that the laws of physics remain the same no matter where you are. The laws of economics change a little bit from time to time. The laws of market design change from time to time, but the laws of physics are the same in each of these markets. So look, with that, I'll hand over now to Marie, the floor back to Marie to moderate the questions.
All right. Thank you, Oliver, for that insightful discussion and a great presentation. So I'm confident that our audience has gained valuable insights. So now we move on to the most exciting segment of this webinar, our Q&A session. But to our audience, we thank you for actively participating by sharing your questions earlier. So some of those questions might have been answered during Lloyd's presentation, but of course, for the benefit of the others, let's dive into your questions and provide you with the answers you have been eagerly awaiting. So let's get started. So we have here a very interesting question for you, Oliver. So it says, could you please elaborate on the role of batteries in supporting data centers demands in Australia? Projection to the future, what is the feasible option for data centers? And lastly, how reliable battery storage to supply the data centers.
So one of the critical points with data centers is, of course, they're massive loads, right? And from our understanding of it is they just run flat all the time. One of the things that's really important about data centers is not so much how batteries are going to support data centers, although they will, but how data centers are going to change the outlook for batteries. If you put a lot of data centers into the system, you're going to find that pretty quickly demand's going to rise, which it already is off the back of these. And the higher the level of demand, the more volatility there is in the market. The more volatility there is in the market, the more profitable batteries will be. Secondly, one of the other things is as well is that data centers might make a big contribution to peak loads. And one of the questions for the battery operators is, can they actually provide the peak loads during those periods? And is it a cheaper way of doing it to provide a battery than to upgrade a network or upgrade or build an OCGT? So there's a lot of interplay between data centers, which just represent a different type of load, and batteries.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing, Oliver. That was very helpful. So, thank you again to our audience who send their questions. So, good to know that we are really focusing on the long-term viability, sustainability, and cost-effective for battery storage solutions in data centers in Australia. So, we move on to our next question. So, for our next question, we have, why do sorry, why do you have to constrain the cycle of batteries?
So we don't have to, right? We don't have to constrain it, but it turns out that batteries have cycle limits that are implicit with them either through their warranties or through the length of time that that battery can operate. And one of the things we often have been asked to do is to remove the cycle limits and say, what if we just let this battery operate as many times a day as it wants? And that can actually show us what the value of those cycles is now versus in the future. So interestingly enough, it's a really great question. Cycle limits themselves are something that are often imposed by our clients who say we don't want to cycle it more than once a day for warranty reasons, for example. But interestingly enough, when you remove that restriction, you can sometimes improve the profitability of the battery. But you also affect its the lifetime of the battery, which you've got to take into consideration as well, because there are only so many cycles life in the battery.
All right. So thanks again, Oliver, for sharing your expertise. So, of course, to ensure that models can provide actionable insights for decision makers, so their designs policies and planning investments, as well as optimizing the operations in the energy market. So I think that is a general, information. But we move on to the next question, and it's another interesting question here. So it goes, how should we approach long-term modeling to deal with things like the recently announced review of energy market rules?
That's a great one, right? They've got the big review of the energy market rules. So one of the things is that despite the fact that there are many things about our market which might change, one of them that is probably going to stay reasonably similar, that I would expect to stay reasonably similar, is the operational way that we run the system. The investment way that we run the system, in terms of whether we have a capacity market that gets put over the top or whether we have an ahead market or something like that, those are the things that could change. But I think that one of the great things about the use of a tool like Gurobi is that you can even factor that in. So you can even say, what if we wanted to factor in the fact that we're going to have an ahead market? Or what if you wanted to factor in the fact that we're going to have a lower market price cap and a capacity market? You can still do that. You just need to change the formulation that you use. And so to me, this is an even more powerful tool because it's a test bed for those sorts of things. And it's even something that the people who are designing the market should be thinking about and often are thinking about. A lot of our work is to do with what happens if we change the rules of the game and how that will change the way that things operate into the future. So, funnily enough, the biggest impact that I think a tool like this can have, or a way of thinking like this can have, is that it can actually help us think about what will happen if we change the game. and how that will change the outworkings of the profitability of individual assets.
Okay, so something our audience to take note. So thank you again, Oliver, for sharing and for breaking down that so well. So we move on to our next question, and it goes, as the optimization model would be perfect foresight, whereas performance of actual batteries historically in the market varies between operators and in different years. So how would someone consider building a battery make informed decision based on the theoretical maximum revenues versus historical realities?
So there are three ways of doing this, right? The first is that we accept that we do a crude mechanism and we say this is the optimal. What's a percentage of that we can achieve? A percentage of perfect, as they call it, percentage of perfect. I don't like that as much, right? What I like to look at is how's the battery actually operating, and can we expect that this is a reasonable assessment, that perfect foresight is a reasonable assessment. So what we see is a lot of the time is that when we look into the future, we see that there are periods of the day that effectively the model's capturing by picking the best times of the day and discharging at the best times of the day to make a profit. Are they reasonable? That's something that we can actually tell from the model itself. The third way of doing this is to actually ask the question, which we do a lot of work for in terms of our short-term forecasting, of given that there's uncertainty on a day-to-day basis of when things are going to occur, how might something operate when we consider it to be an agent-based type model? That's a different framework, but even as a different framework, you can still use the optimization as a way of assuming how people will make decisions into the future. So even when optimization isn't the only part of the answer, it's still a very powerful part of the answer. And this is a question we get all of the time: is, if is perfect foresight a reasonable assumption? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
All right. Thank you so much again, Oliver. So, for that practical benefits and insights that you have gained from such approach, also making a well-informed decisions for our stakeholders. Um, so, to our audience, we have been receiving a lot of questions, and if we might not be able to cover those questions during this an hour of webinar, we'll make sure to come back to you in some of our content pieces or through an email. So we have here another question for you, Oliver. So it goes, you've spoken about outlook for energy spreads, but what about FCAS? For how
Yeah.
long do you expect FCAS to be the significant contributor to battery economics? And do you expect this vary significantly within the states?
So I think there are 3 points to make about FCAS. The first one is when we put a lot of batteries in, it's going to collapse, right? And even if it doesn't collapse, it's not a very big market. It's very small. So we often hear people making business cases on the basis of FCAS, right? FCAS is a small market. Even if the prices were at the market price cap, how much of that are you going to get versus the other batteries that are in the system? So that's the first point. The second point to make is that the advent of batteries themselves has massively diminished the value that there will be in FCAS. So FCAS is just going to be collapsing to begin with. But the third one as well, which I think is sort of probably the most important story about FCAS, is if you can't make your business model on energy, right, FCAS isn't going to help you, right? Like realistically, the business model for these batteries over the long term has to be a business model that's on the basis of energy. And we're often advising people about the fact that don't make your business case on FCAS, right? It can't it if FCAS prices are high, it's because energy prices are high, right, into the future. So, if you're not able to make your business case on energy, you won't be able to make it with FCAS involved.
All right. Thanks so much, Oliver, for that another great insight. So, to our audience again, please send your questions to our Q&A panel so that we didn't miss those questions, and we can still come back to you if in case we wouldn't have the time to answer all of your questions. So we move on to our next question, Oliver. So here it says, how much more? Sorry. How much more efficiency in the system with batteries can be gained by demand-side management from large industrial customers?
That's a
Lee,
great
why?
question. Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think the answer is that, funnily enough, batteries have really killed the value of demand side management, right? Like, if before we had batteries, demand side management was the only way of shifting load. Now, right, batteries allow us to shift load. And so the funny thing is that batteries have sort of eaten the lunch of demand side management. And for so long, we saw so much focus on the idea of what if we can shift demand around the place. Now we've got batteries, and so that's diminished the value of it. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that we don't have to rely on turning things off as the only way of moving load around. If you can turn things off, it still will have enormous value, but it's going to have value in a different way. It's not going to be the short term thing that batteries provide. It's going to be, can you turn off for a week in the middle of winter when the load is extremely high and the wind droughts occur? If you can turn off during that period, that's going to be real demand side management that batteries can't provide. So that's the new nature of demand side management, is a much longer term concept than the very fast responsiveness that we've seen in the past.
All right, thanks, Oliver. So again, to our audience, please take note, something for you to take away and for you to also consider. So we have a few, I think there's a lot of questions coming in. And again, thank you to our audience. We have a very interactive audience right now with us. So we have our next question is, sorry, let me just read this one. Is the BESS dispatch modeling only based on optimization? Are there ways you introduce some level of imperfection into the dispatch, or is the analysis generally based around theoretical maximal revenue capturing?
So it's mainly based around theoretical maximal revenue capturing. But one of the things is there as well is that when we're doing these sorts of analyses, we tell people that this is the theoretical maximum. Um, that said, when we actually look at the operational profiles that are yielded from these things, a lot of them give us a very good indication of the fact that those reasonable operational strategies that can yield that sort of outcome. And so what we need to ask the question of, as I said before, is how reasonable is it to expect that you're going to capture that value? If you need to charge in the middle of the day and discharge in the evening, you're probably going to be able to do that. If you need to charge in the middle of the day, discharge an hour later, charge again, and then charge an hour later, discharge an hour later, that might be more complicated and harder for someone to capture. So what we look at is the actual operational profiles that are yielded from these things as a reference point that is therefore helpful to ask the big question of, can we actually capture that value?
All right, thank you so much, Oliver. So we have here some few more interesting questions for you, but for our team. So if you guys wanted to share or to add on to Oliver answer, please do so. So we move on to our next question. So how do you represent bidding behavior of batteries? For example, do you use bands of prices and quantities, a single VOM or something else?
So the bidding behavior of batteries is represented in the things that are actually generating the prices. So this is just a price taker model at this point, right, that we're talking about here. Sometimes people ask us to actually put a battery which is so big into the model itself. So if they want an assessment of a really accurate assessment, we need to redo our dispatch. We need to redo our modeling. But when we're doing the actual bidding of it, what we do is we have different bands, but the major thing that we capture is there's got to be an opportunity cost of a cycle. So sometimes you'll hear people say that batteries have zero marginal cost. That is not true. They have an opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost is real. if you've only got so many cycles in a battery, each cycle has an implicit value over the life of the battery. And so what we're trying to do is to capture that with our bidding behavior. Now, the way we typically do that is to assume long run average cost, which is a crude measure, but it's nevertheless the best one we've found over time. So we actually work out what the long run average cost of a cycle is, use that as the opportunity cost. So we don't see batteries cycling for less than the long run average cost of a cycle. That then feeds into our spot price model, which we use to do these sorts of battery analyses.
All right, so thanks again, Oliver. Thank you so much for that detailed answer. It was very helpful. So for our audience, please take note. So we have here for our next question. So how do you appropriately value the co-optimization of the energy market and ancillary service markets as the increase of the capacity of batteries installed in the system, given that the batteries in the future become price setters, particularly in the ancillary service markets?
So keep in mind that in the ancillary services markets in the future, if we have more and more batteries, competition will suggest that the prices will collapse. So we can't have 10 gigawatts of batteries fighting for 700 megawatts of raised services without something happening. And the answer is the price is going to collapse. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do we capture this dynamic into the future? We actually run models to actually work out what the FCAS prices will be, which have supply and demand captured. So that a key input into that is how many batteries there are in the system. And so when we see a lot of batteries entering the system in the near term, the only outcome that we can see is FCAS prices collapsing, as I've said previously.
All right, there we go. So we are keep receiving questions from our audience. Again, please do type your questions in our Q&A panel so that we
I
wouldn't miss.
probably I probably should have taken a little bit longer to present, and that way I wouldn't have had to answer questions for so long. It's
Right.
exhausting.
Well, we do have, like I've said, we do have a unique set of audience and very
I know we've got a lot of
interactive.
people. They're really engaged. They've got some great questions. So yeah.
Yeah, so we have actually a lot of interesting questions, and of course, Oliver, as much as you can, you wanted to answer these questions. But of course, we value our audience time as well, so we'll keep in mind for those questions that we might not gonna be cover during our an hour webinar. So let's move on to our next question, Oliver. So, what are the key drivers of cycling degeneration, degrade, degradation that are incorporated? Sorry, let me start again. What are the key drivers of cycling gradation that are incorporated into your modeling suite?
So we capture all of the factors of degradation. So if you cycle faster, you degrade faster. If you cycle deeper, you degrade faster. These are the sorts of things that we capture. And obviously with batteries, you can just take this to the nth degree. We don't do that, right? We are only capturing some of the key factors that affect degradation. But one of the things we know from our discussions with some of the people who are experts in batteries and battery degradation is that how deep you discharge can also affect those sorts of things. Those are areas where we've tried in the past to build bespoke models, and we have done so. But that's not something we do as a matter of course.
All right. Thanks, Oliver. So, we have here for our next question, and what types of storage offtake agreements have you seen in the market?
The types of storage offtake agreements, we've seen all sorts of them. We've seen virtual swaps so virtual spreads where you effectively have someone selling the ability to move energy from one time of the day to another. We've seen people just with straight tolling agreements. There's a range of different arrangements, and they're also different depending on how the battery's actually operated. So it's as many and varied as one of the things is that it's not overly uniform at the moment, which is really sort of probably the main thing to take away.
All right. Thanks again, Oliver, for that answer. And of course, something our audience again can take note and for takeaways. So I think we're just gonna have to answer a few more questions here. For our next question, Oliver, do you co-optimize wholesale and FCAS markets in your market scenario modeling? So
Yes,
this is one a great question. Go
yes,
ahead.
we do. We do.
All
So
right.
that's the whole issue of running the two together, right? Is that we co-optimize the two. So we factor in, like, one of the challenges is to actually factor it into the original wholesale price modeling. We actually do FCAS prices separately on an off model basis. But then when we're optimizing the battery, the running of the battery, it's fully co-optimized.
Mm-hmm. Good to know, Oliver. So for our audience, if you're interested in exploring more about application optimization capabilities, we would be happy to arrange a separate discussion to tailor to your interest. And of course, we will provide you with the detailed answers and follow up with you after this webinar too. Okay, so our next question goes, what are the key assumptions around battery recycling in the energy transition? Is it
Ah,
viewed? All right, sorry.
yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
We're not really thinking about that at this point, but it's a big issue, isn't it? So if we're going to build all of these batteries, what's going to happen to all of the batteries once they're depleted? There are no assumptions about that, apart from the fact that at some point we have to replace them. So that's probably my answer to that question there.
Straightforward answer. Thank you, Oliver. So, as a follow-up question in that, is it viewed as liability due to its cost and complexity, or as an asset due to its potential for resource recovery?
Neither. We just assume it's scrap value of zero at the end of the life of the battery. So which is probably a pretty primitive assumption, but it's something that we haven't thought about to this day.
All right, there we go. So we have, I think, down to our last question, if not mistaken. So how does your modeling suite accounts for batteries, imperfect foresight over market prices generated under each market scenario?
So I think I've sort of gone to this a bit before. Look, the answer is that whenever you hear someone talk about imperfect foresight, you're talking about making the model dumber, right? And we can easily do that. Like, there are lots of ways we can do that. The best way to do it is actually is not to actually look at these things on a half hourly basis, but to ask the question of how do batteries tend to perform on a given day, right? And that's really where you get that percentage of perfect number. And so, from my perspective, the best way of doing this is to do little studies that actually ask the question of how would a battery have performed on a day like today, for example. Where in New South Wales the prices are going to the market price cap. As much as people say, oh, you might have imperfect foresight, if you're not charged with your battery ready to go now, right, you're crazy. So, realistically, my dog could work out how to optimize the battery on a day like today. The question is, how do we do that over the course of the entire life of the battery so that we can do those calculations and work out what the best possible outcome is? That's not straightforward. My dog can't do that. So, realistically, the idea of imperfect foresight, we've often had a lot of people focus on, oh, imperfect foresight's going to drastically change the results. Interestingly enough, if you actually look at individual days and you see how well a battery would perform on given days, the imperfect foresight assumption is not that important. The only caveat on that is when you have people getting a large amount of their value in the battery off of the basis of half-hourly noise. And half-hourly noise that we've seen, or 5 minute to 5 minute noise, is something where a lot of foresight, it makes a lot of difference to foresight. We don't actually have half-hourly noise in our structural forecasts of prices in the future. So there's no worry about that. We're not capturing that dynamic. We can easily put it in, but it's at that point that the perfect foresight's important. Because if you've got a difference every 5 minutes between what the price is, it matters drastically whether you've got perfect foresight. That's a pretty complicated topic, by the way, to answer in a question. But if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to I'm happy to run them through it afterwards on in an email or similar.
Thank you, Oliver. So, as Oliver says, we are always open to have a separate discussion if you need more specific answer and more information regarding the questions. So, we are down to our last question given the time constraint. So, we have here how do you model systems events? Unpredictable events that may occur irregularly but contribute a lot to revenue, like generator outages, sorry.
So we capture generator outages in the supply demand of our prices. So we already capture generator outages, but what we don't do is we don't factor in massive events like separation of regions. And one of the reasons is we've seen a lot of people who actually their entire business model is based on those events. And from our perspective, they're nice events if they occur, but if you want to bank on them, right, good luck, right? Like you should be aware of the fact that you're banking on them. We can easily put those into our modeling, but most of our clients aren't interested in putting them into the modeling unless they're trying to pump up the numbers as much as possible to get some good outcome. And we're not big fans of doing that.
All right, that makes sense. So thank you again, Oliver, for that answer. So I think we're actually that concludes our session, our Q&A session. So again, for those questions that we didn't cover, so don't worry, we'll send it to Oliver and or to our team so we can get back to you in some of the content pieces or through an email. And as we had said, we are open to arrange a quick demo or a quick discussion with you guys to address your questions. So we have come to our end of the session today. So I have to say it's a wrap. So thank you, Oliver, for we are truly honored to have you today and for sharing your insights and expertise with our to our audience. And of course, to our audience, we sincere thank you to for your investing your time and for supporting our webinar. So we hope you have enjoyed our topic, modeling the revenue and operation of batteries in the national electricity market over decades. So kindly be informed as well that the recording will be shared to you after this event as for your reference. Also, a brief survey will appear as we conclude this webinar. So we would appreciate if you could take a moment to complete it. So thank you. And Oliver, do you got any last message or any announcement that you'd like to share to our audience? You can actually do that right now. Go ahead,
Just
please.
just thank you very much for attending, and thank you for the great questions. We really appreciate the input on these sorts of things and your support. And thank you to Marie for doing a great job on moderating. So yeah,
Thanks, Oliver. So again, to our audience, thank you for your time, and we hope that the insight that we have shared proved to be valuable for you. So enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.